Now, this is the evaluation for theory. And what I want you to do this evaluation thinking about is pretty much just evaluating how well you could hold a strategic conversation, or how comfortable you would be teaching these concepts to other people. And this is a shorter one. It's really just intended to get at the core understanding of what I think is important to know as a poker player in order to be adaptable, in order to understand, for example, what you're taking away from your sims or what you're taking away from your study. I think this is the kind of background knowledge that's really important to feel confident about. So again, rating 1 to 5 with an evaluation key of fundamental, intermediate, or advanced. And for preflop ranges, I've started with a list of, I actually talk about this in the preflop video in the game planning section. If you haven't gotten there, well, hopefully you haven't gotten there yet, because this is still the beginning of the course. But the fundamental areas here that I feel are important to understand preflop is, how do I adjust to the blinds and antes? So and rake and different positions and different stack depths. Just this whole thing together, all these fundamental ones in the preflop area. This isn't about how well have you memorized your preflop strategy. It's how well do you understand what's happening preflop. I think there's a lot of training content on Run It Once and on other sites that covers these extremely fundamental concepts. Or if you're like me and you learned the game through books way back, then you probably read some information about this stuff, but who knows how relevant it was or how well you maintained that knowledge over your career. But you could even just take this as a rating of, how confident do I feel about understanding what different ante-structures or different blind structures do to preflop ranges, because you want to be able to understand if you're playing a bomb pot, or if you're playing a big blind ante game, or if you're playing heads up with antes, or heads up with whatever blind structure gets thrown at you. You want to feel confident that you know the adjustment for that. So I've done a number of experiments that help me understand this. I've also read a good bit of information that makes me feel confident about this. Adjusting to rake. So do you understand the difference between a high rake game and a low rake game and how that affects preflop? Positional awareness, just the very basics of this, understanding how being in late position versus early position, or being in the small blind, affects the way you want to play preflop. And adjusting to stack depth. So if you're a tournament player, this is especially important, or a sit and go player. But even being a cash game player, adjusting to 500 big blinds versus 200 versus 100. How confident do you feel about making these adjustments? And different sizing. So this is adjusting to players who throw different preflop sizings at you. How confident are you? When you face the 5x open, when you face the open limp, when you face all these different strategies, do you feel confident that you could explain how you're going to adjust to these things? And do you feel confident that it's the correct way to go about it? I do, by the way, always just have this does not apply column. Of course, if you're playing in a game, for example, if prize pool considerations, if ICM is not really it's not going to come up if you don't play tournaments or sit and goes. So if this doesn't matter to you, feel free to just skip over those questions. But for me, that's an area I feel good about, but it's an area I could definitely keep working in my theoretical understanding. Polarized and linear ranges. I talked about this in the preflop section later as well. I feel good about this, although I do think that my understanding of where they come up could be improved. So I'm not going to give myself a perfect rating there, but I do think I could teach, the majority of the concepts that are necessary in this category. So I didn't rate myself lower than 3 in any of those areas. So I'm going to move on to post-flop. With post-flop range construction, I'm thinking about, how confident do you feel about understanding polarized versus merged construction, but also when those come up, like I mentioned before. So when do polarized ranges come up in game? When do merge ranges come up? How are we using them? Why does this matter? All of this is kind of what we're getting at here. I'm going to give myself not perfect, but a good rating there. flop textures, I'm talking about the difference between having straight and flush draws versus not having straight and flush draws, understanding what ace high means versus king high versus other high cards, just understanding how flop textures impact the way that you approach strategy from the beginning of the hand. This is something that I've worked on a lot with solvers, and this is kind of the main focus of aggregate reports and the way that I game plan later in the course. So that's something I feel very confident about. Bet sizing variation, so choosing your bet sizes and also bet frequency variation. So polarized ranges might have lower bet frequency, linear ranges might have higher bet frequency. Understanding the interaction of these things and also the interaction with different textures. This again is a big focus of my study and the way that I game plan. So I feel quite good about this. But you can see the main question here is just how are the ranges constructed and how do they change? So you don't want to skip over either part of that question when rating yourself here. With turn and river textures, I would say that I feel pretty good about how ranges are constructed for sure. But there are different turn textures in particular, but also river textures where I feel like my understanding of how range construction changes could be better. I think in the tournament environment, my turn construction is still a little bit off compared to my history of playing 100 big blind made me approach turn textures a certain way or turn strategy a certain way. And I think I'm getting better at that, but I could still focus some work there. So I didn't rate myself lower than 3 anywhere. But again, if you're not feeling super confident about the theory in any of these areas, just make note of it. All we're doing here is we're building a list that you can come back to, and you can choose to allocate some amount of your study time to those areas once you see how long that list is or how important it is based on the ratings here. These concepts here, I'm zooming out a little bit from pre-flop or post-flop or specific scenarios. I'm really just talking. I'm talking generally enough here that you could apply this to different games even. But understanding the fundamentals of, applying a bet size to a situation, applying a bet frequency to a situation, this is very similar to the post-flop answer before. I'd be surprised if many people had, different scores from here. But you just want to think again about like the mathematics and the application of going through this process and how confident you feel about doing that. And the same thing for bluffing rivers and bluff catching rivers. These are concepts that I'm going to be tackling in a live seminar at some point after course launch. I think that these are very important. Actually, a lot of these concepts here, perhaps all of them now that I'm looking at it again, are things that I'm going to cover in seminars after the course launches. But the idea here is understanding not only like what leads us to, it sounds very general here, bluffing rivers, right? But I'm saying, do you understand the math of bluffing rivers, I guess, in a theoretical sense? How often can we bluff? What hand class do we need to bluff? What sizing are we choosing? How does that all line up with our value range? So the math of like constructing bluffs, but also like the incentives of bluffing in general. Do you understand how we can generate profit by bluffing rivers? Do you understand how we could shift our river bluffing strategy in an exploitative sense? And the same applies to bluff catching rivers. Adjusting to player profile. This is something as a heads up player, I think I've developed a lot of skill. But, how well do you play against nits? How well do you play against loose maniacs? How well can you read into the specifics of what even like a good to very good player is doing and understand kind of in a theoretical sense, but also in a practical sense, what am I supposed to do against that player? If you're frequently feeling lost, how do I adjust to this person? What am I supposed to do against this player? I did mark this as intermediate. I think it's a pretty dynamic concept, but this area has a lot of potential. It's just one little tick box on this whole evaluation, but this is pretty much like how good of an exploitative player do you feel you are? After this range advantage, this is, I think this is a concept that gets kind of thrown around in a variety of ways. I could see it being very confusing to interpret, especially if you're a frequent training video watcher. I think it gets used differently by different coaches. But what I would say is, how well do you understand the idea of the player with the stronger range reacts in this way, and all the different variations of how that might happen. So the stronger range with more, nut strength hands, the stronger range in a linear way. Again, if this is perplexing to you, if this seems overly complicated to you, there's a lot of different stuff packed into this concept. But I think that it's worth trying to break down what's happening in range advantage situations, because they happen. I mean, they happen so frequently and they happen in different ways. So this is a more dynamic concept than I think it's portrayed to be in a lot of cases. I'm actually going to rate myself a little lower here, just because it's hard to categorize every way that this comes up. And I think that I could still do a better job in my ability to teach this concept. And then using mixed strategies, more practically speaking, but also just like interpreting what is happening in a sim. When you look at a sim and it's using a mixed strategy, how confident do you feel in understanding that? Is that intimidating to you? Do you understand what to do with that information? But also, do you understand why it's happening? And just like the general idea of how a GTO solution could be mixed, because that in itself could be confusing. So this is another really good one, I think, to break down into all of its components and try to build up that knowledge over time, especially I think in these cases with the help of a coach, which is why I'm saving these concepts for interactive seminars rather than trying to do like an all-encompassing video on them, because it's not clear to me until I start talking to students, what it is that they need to put the puzzle together to understand some of these things. So just like the other areas, you want to if you rate yourself lower than a 3, take note, and then start to build lists of where are you strong in theory, where are you weak in theory. And I wrote here, which would you like to study the most? Just a little different from, also just writing down what fundamental concepts you'd like to add to your study plan. But I think the theory stuff here, it requires some desire to engage with the material. I know that studying is just boring for a lot of people. And it takes some playing around with different study methods, or different ways of taking in knowledge to figure out what works for you. So just starting with like an area that's interesting to you is a really good motivator. And in the other evaluation, when you're looking at your study methods, that's also supposed to help you figure out, what's the best way that I can improve in this area without just wasting my time, right? Kind of trudging along through stuff that you don't care about. So we're trying to find the right study method and also the right concepts at the same time. So that's what this question is for.